Scripture for the message is Acts 25, verses 1 through 12. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priest and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking a favor against Paul, that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, he said, let the men of authority among you go down with me. If there's anything wrong about the man, let him bring charges against him. And he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, and then he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal, and he ordered Paul to be brought. Now when he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, that they were not able to prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I'm a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. There are a lot of claims to the truth these days, and these claims conflict. There's arguments about a country, there's arguments about science, there's arguments about society issues. All these arguments on both sides are based on self-centered understanding. Now, why can we say that? It's because only Jesus is the truth of God. And when he chooses to work through us, he doesn't lead us to argue and bicker with other people. We don't have to win arguments that the world likes to debate. Jesus loved us all and died for us all, not for just one group or just another group on the other side. And he shows this to us, that he is for us all, not by arguments, but by behavior. The behavior that he exhibited when he walked on this earth, the behavior that he shines through our lives today, shining a better way to the world around us, shining not pretense, but truth. This is what our text, I think, lifts up for us. Paul's been in prison 2 years in Caesarea, and a new Roman governor, Festus, arrives. We see the contrast between Paul's behavior on the one hand and Festus and the Jewish leaders on the other hand. Festus, very early in his reign, wants to go up to Jerusalem, the major city there, and the Jewish leaders quickly bring accusations against Paul. And they ask Festus a favor. Send him to Jerusalem in order to come before our council to be tried. Now, all of this is a pretense, because they don't want to try him at their council. They've planned an ambush, just like those 40 men that had a chapter or so ago. They're planning to kill him on his way to Jerusalem. Now, Festus answers partly for his own self-interest here, that I'm not going to be here long. Paul's being held in Caesarea, so why take all the time to bring him here and have me wait? I was only going to be here a few days, so I'm going back to Caesarea. Well, let some of your men of power, is what it literally says, come back with me to Caesarea, and if there's anything out of place in this man, let them accuse him. So if he's done anything wrong, you'll have a chance to accuse him back. So a few days later, they go back. Festus sits on the judgment seat, the official place where he declares verdicts, and he has Paul brought in. Many and serious charges are brought by the Jewish leaders who came back with Festus, but they were not able to demonstrate any of these charges to be true. Paul can simply say, I've done no wrong towards the Jewish law, or the temple, or even to Caesar. But Festus, quote, wishing to do the Jews a favor, unquote, asked Paul if he's willing to go back to Jerusalem to be judged by him there. Now, obviously, this is a pretext also. This isn't normal Roman behavior. Caesarea is the capital of the Roman province. They're the center of their power. The judgment seats there. That's where you get tried for any charges that would be worthy of being charged by, according to the Romans' eyes. But he's trying to do the Jews a favor so that it makes his governorship easier at the time. Paul has to answer, I'm standing at Caesar's judgment seat. Since he's the governor, he's a representative of Caesar. This is where citizens are trying to commit crimes. He says to Festus, you yourself know well that I've done no crime. And even if I had, he says, I did anything wrong, and was deserving of death. I'm not avoiding death. Now that's a very surprising statement to Festus and the leaders because of how unself-centered it is. I don't avoid death. But if there is nothing to their charges, which there isn't, no one is able to give me freely to them or give me to them as a favor. I appeal to Caesar. So it's interesting that Paul has to use Roman law in order to be used against the Roman governor himself and what the Roman governor wants to do. It was a citizen's right to be able to be tried by Caesar himself. So Paul appeals to Caesar. He's known that this so-called truth that the leaders are saying against Paul and even Festus's behavior are both self-centered. They're both pretensions. But Paul is being led by Jesus, the truth of God. And Jesus has told Paul, you're going to witness to me in Rome. But the Roman governor wants him to go to Jerusalem. And if he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to be killed on the way, and he wouldn't be able to get to Rome. So Paul has to use Roman law in order to get himself to where Jesus wants him to be, even though by saying, I appeal to Caesar, this means that he has to go there as a prisoner. And he's going to be bound, and we'll see in a couple of chapters, he goes by ship, and there's a shipwreck, and there's lots of danger. But he has to go as a prisoner instead of as a free man. Festus, by Roman law, should have said, there's nothing to these accusations that's worthy of a Roman crime, so you're released. And he would have still went to Rome as a free person. But instead, he can only go bound now as a prisoner. So that shows how not self-serving Paul's action is. Paul does this as a service not to himself, but as a service to Jesus. It's an act of love for the one who first loved him. Paul doesn't get involved with wrangling about points of the law and religion with the Jewish leaders. He simply serves the Jesus who is far and acts on behalf of us all. We too are called to avoid conflict and bickering that's so prevalent in our world today. To avoid the pretense also behind those arguments which claim to be true. Instead, let us be witnesses for Jesus, the truth of God, who he alone is the one who doesn't act against anyone, but for the sake of us all. Let's hear an example of a man named Hartley Dailey. He and his wife Jane's behavior helped someone who was caught up in a world of pretense. Hartley was working on his farm one afternoon near the barn, and he saw way off past his property along the edge there was a car pulled off the road. It seemed to be a well-dressed man, dressed in a nice suit. He was pulled the hood up, was looking underneath, and he'd go back to the car and try to start it and go back and forth between under the hood and the car. It didn't seem like he was having any luck. Hartley was in the middle of some work that he couldn't put down, so he finished up his chores. And by that time, it was starting to get a little bit dark. So he got a flashlight out, walked down the road. He startled the man as he came up to him, and the man seemed to be especially nervous, and yet he did seem to be grateful for some help. The car was the same model as Hartley's was, it was just a little bit newer. After tinkering around for a second, Hartley said, "It's your coil." "It can't be, I just had a new one put in a month ago." This was a young man, about 21. He sounded almost in tears. "You see, mister, I'm a long way from home. I just got to get it started. I just got to." Hartley tried to explain that coils can be pretty touchy, and some of them last a long time, and some of them don't last very long at all, and he suggested putting his coil from his own car into this stranger's car to see whether it would start up, and if so, he knew a store just down the road where they could go and they could purchase a new one. Well, a few minutes later, the car started right up. Hartley told his wife, Jane, that they were going down to the store. The young man acted kind of odd, and he gave Hartley the money instead of getting out of the car and going in, and said, "Would you go and buy the coil while I stay here?" He used the excuse, "Well, my clothes are all wet and I don't want to go in." Back at the barn, the coils were changed. Hartley's young daughter came out and said, "Mother says that supper is ready." And she turned to the stranger. She said, "You're to come in and eat too." The man protested and saying he was in too much of a hurry. "But you need to eat anyway," Hartley said. "How long could that take? And besides, no one comes to Jane's house at mealtime and leaves without eating. You wouldn't want her to lie down in the mud in front of your car, would you?" So the young man continued to protest, but he allowed himself to be led into the house. And Hartley thought to himself, the protests seem to have something else behind them besides just politeness that I don't want to impose on you folks. After Hartley said the prayer, the man was fidgety all through the meal and just kind of picked at his food. And finally, when everybody else seemed to be done with their plates, he stood up and announced that he had to leave. "Now look here," Jane said, "your clothes are all wet, you're cold, you're tired. Stay with us tonight. Tomorrow you can start out all warm and dry and rested." He reluctantly agreed after arguing back and forth a bit. Jane dried his clothes by the fire that night, pressed them in the morning, made a nice big breakfast for him, which this time he seemed to eat slowly and enjoy. And then he thanked them profusely, and he left. And oddly enough, when the car went down the driveway, it turned back in the direction the man came from, instead of to the direction he was going. And Hartley just figured, well, he made some kind of a mistake. They didn't hear from him and didn't expect to, but many years later, a letter came in the mail. I don't suppose you remember the young man you helped years ago when his car broke down. I was running away. I stole a large sum of money from my employer, and I had it in the car. I had had Christian parents, but I fell in with the wrong crowd and started to think that I deserved to get what comes to me. You and your wife were so nice to me, I began to see where I was wrong. And before morning, I made a decision to turn back and return the money. My employer could have prosecuted me, and I could have been in prison for many years, but he gave me another chance. Now I'm a successful businessman, and I could pay you back many times over, but I feel you wouldn't want the money, so I'm establishing a fund to help others who made the same mistake I did. Jane looked at Hartley as he finished the letter with the strangest look, and she quoted, "When I was a stranger, you took me in. When I was hungry, you fed me." Now, they didn't know the pretense this man was trying to live by, and if they had, they could have probably argued with him all day and evening and not changed his mind. But his mind and his heart got changed by behavior, not by arguments. There are a lot of claims to the truth today, and many arguments and debates that surround those claims. But they're all based on self-centered understanding. Only Jesus is the truth of God. And when he works through us, he doesn't lead us to argue and bicker with the people around us. Jesus isn't for one group and against another. His love and his life lived and his death was for the sake of us all. And he shows this by his behavior as he walked on earth and by our behavior as he works through us. Behavior that shines a better way to the world around us. Behavior that shows not pretense, but the truth of God. So may our lives serve this truth, Jesus himself, with an act of love for the one who first loved us. Amen.